Hello, and welcome to the Three Peaks Podcast,
where we take a break from the hike of life
and appreciate the view.
Today, we have a very special guest, Tammy Peterson. Tammy, welcome to the podcast.
Why? Thank you so much for inviting me.
So our audience doesn't know a lot about you, so we wanted to give you a quick minute to introduce yourself.
All right. So I'm Jordan Peterson's wife, most publicly known as Jordan Peterson's wife. I have been married for 32 years. We grew up together, met when we were 8 and 7 years old.
Wow.
Went to school together. His dad taught me grade 6. So I knew his family very well. When I graduated high school, I went to university. I studied kinesiology, so I have a degree in sciences. I became a massage therapist, and I was a massage therapist for something like 25 years. I also went to art school and studied. I studied broadly. So I studied some graphic design. I studied jewelry. I studied ceramics. I liked ceramics and printmaking. So I like to do lots of different things. I've renovated a number of houses. And now I travel with my husband. He is on a book tour, and I go on stage with him and ask him questions that are submitted from the audience.
For my first question is mostly about a career. When you go into a career, it's inevitable that you can come face to face with failures and setbacks. And when it comes to your career, has there been any failures or setbacks that you experienced, but was really a lesson that taught you, just to do something better next time?
That's a good question. That's a very good question. So I would start back when I decided to go to university. I'm a creative person, as you might have gathered from what I told you.
Yeah.
So it was difficult for me to decide what I was going to do because everything seemed to be interesting.
Right.
And so I went to university the first year. I studied a Bachelor of Arts, but I was living in Montreal, Quebec, and the society was French and I was English, and I was supporting myself through university. So I left Montreal to get a job in an English community that was nearby because I found it difficult to make money there. And I thought about what I'd studied there, and I thought that it might be good to continue, but I didn't quite know. I mean, a Bachelor of Arts is pretty varied. I was studying philosophy, English, French, drama. I had lots of different things, and I was interested in a lot of them. And so then I took a year off and I worked for a year. I worked for a year. I was a lifeguard, so I worked in a swimming pool, and I worked in a drapery shop and measured drapery for people's houses. I couldn't believe they let me do that when I was 19 years old, but whatever. That's what I did. And I took a couple of courses. I took a first year psychology course that year, but never went to university very much. And then I moved back to Montreal, near Montreal. I moved to Ottawa. It was a bilingual university it was a bilingual town. It was Ottawa has the Ottawa River running between Ottawa and Hull is on the French side, and Ottawa is on the Ontario side, and Ontario is English, and Hull is French. So I was going to still benefit from having some French culture, but be able to work. And so that's where I moved. I worked in a restaurant, and I worked some more in a swimming pool. But then I read a book called What Color's Your Parachute? It was a book in the 80s that people in the 70s, probably in the 80s. And it's something that I could read, and there were lots of questions in it to help guide me to what career I might choose. And so at the end of reading that and answering all the questions, I went to the university and I said, I'm interested in teaching. I'm interested in sports. I'm interested in medicine. I'm interested in art. And they said, kinesiology. And I said, okay, whatever that is, I'll study it. Because I had been frustrated that I'd started twice and I hadn't continued it to get a bachelor in anything yet. So I decided I was going to do this one. And I guess I made a prayer. I made a prayer that day, and I prayed that if I continued and finished this degree, I would allow myself to study further.
Yeah.
If I dropped out again, I wouldn't allow myself to go back to university. And I see that now as a prayer to my spiritual father, because I think our fathers are often instrumental in helping us bring out our gifts to the world. And so I didn't recognize it at the time, but now I think that's who I was praying to. And I did stick it out. I went through all my physics classes and my chemistry classes and anatomy and all of that. And I really enjoyed my degree.
Right.
But when I got to the end of it, it was a Bachelor of Science. I decided I would pursue massage therapy, which I did without getting a massage therapy license. I was living in Montreal and they didn't have a massage school in Quebec. So I just started advertising that I was a massage therapist. And I looked around and found a store owner who would employ me.
Right.
And the whole time I told you I was interested in art. I worked as an artist model for a while. So I went to art classes and I modeled for art classes and became familiar with what would become a way of studying art, because I didn't have access to that. I was from a place of 2,000 people, 400 miles from the nearest city in northern Alberta. So it was a very remote place I grew up, and there really wasn't a lot of culture there and not a lot of opportunity. And so I didn't know anything about what art school might be like. And so I decided that I'd make some money and offer my services to an art class and learn what art was about by just modeling and watching what everybody was doing in the classes. And at the same time, I started to draw and to paint, and I just on my own, I would draw and paint. And eventually, I went to university and I studied my kinesiology degree, and then I moved close to where my husband was. He was only 2 hours away. He was now in Montreal taking his PhD.
Ah,
And so I moved there, and I got a job as a massage therapist in an Yves Rocher, which was a French place where they did nails and facials and waxings, and they didn't have a massage therapist, and they didn't have anyone who spoke English, so they hired me, and that's where I worked. And I also continued to be an art model at McGill University at the education department, and worked on my portfolio, and then applied to Concordia University and got into art school there. But I got married and I was pregnant at that time. And I didn't know whether the paints would be toxic to my fetus. So I decided that I would put off going to art school until I was done having a baby. But I found myself an art teacher outside of the university, and I studied with him and learned how to paint a portrait and paint still life. And so I still continued with my art when I was pregnant, and I worked as a massage therapist till I couldn't get around the table anymore. So I was really a self-made person in many ways, but I do realize now, because I was creative, it was very tricky for me to decide what I was going to do. So, I started university, I was on 18, and I graduated university when I was 26 because I had a couple of false starts. And a lot of kids go to university and quit. And I don't think that should be any kind of reason not to try again, because we're very young when we're first sent off to university and we haven't formed who we want to be. And if we haven't had good guidance at home to help us to explore who we might be and what we might want in life, then we don't know what we want to do. So it's going to take a while to get organized. Now, I did sometimes work for people. That never always worked out so well because I was, I like to work for myself. I like to work for myself. I worked in a gym as a massage therapist. Later in my life, after I'd been working for myself for many years, I became a personal trainer so I could train people to lift weights. And I was a yoga teacher, so I could teach people yoga. So I wanted to work in a gym because then I had access to the exercise side of things. And then I did massages at the gym for men and women when I was there.
Right.
But I got arthritis in my thumbs. So then I couldn't do any massages as
Yeah.
easily. So I started changing my practice and learning different techniques. And then I studied laser therapy.
Mhm.
And laser therapy is a modality that you can use as a doctor or a physiotherapist or any kind of health practitioner. And it's red light and infrared light that you put a pad on someone's shoulder, say if they have shoulder troubles, and the mitochondria in the cells, because there's mitochondria in each cell. You must have learned in your biology class.
Mhm.
The mitochondria picks up the light, and then it gives the mitochondria energy like when you were younger, right? Younger, because as you get older, you heal slower and slower. And so it helps you to start healing faster. So then you can heal sprains and broken bones and all kinds of things twice as fast as you can without the laser. So I started using that laser on my thumbs, and it helped me. And I had arthritis in my knees as well. But then I also had always had indigestion from the time I was a little kid. So I was always in trouble with my health. And at that point, when I was 40, I realized I had celiac disease. I couldn't eat bread. I always thought bread was a very safe thing to eat. It seemed like the most safe thing to eat. You know, I'd given up meat for a year. That didn't help. I gave up sugar for a year. That didn't seem to help. And I gave up bread. And the next day I started feeling better. So I gave up bread, I went through the house and I looked on all the cans and in every cupboard and in the fridge, everything, anything that might have any grain in it. And I threw it all out and felt much better the next day. And it was when my daughter was quite ill as a young person. She was diagnosed with arthritis when she was only about 6 years old and ended up with a hip and an ankle replacement when she was only 17. And I was always looking to see what was causing her troubles because I knew if she ate oranges, her toe would swell. And so I knew it was food, but I didn't know what food it was, you know. So I stopped her from having candy for quite a long time, but that didn't seem to help. And I took her to naturopaths often, but nobody had any answers for us. But it wasn't until she was about 22 that she decided to study biomedical research and do all our genetics and really start researching and find out what was at the bottom of her problems. Found out she had celiac disease as well, and that she started having. I took her to a naturopath, and she went on an elimination diet. She decided to just eat chicken and broccoli for a month, and some of her symptoms started to go away. And she thought, oh, well, maybe it's food. And so over time, we both ended up on a diet where all we eat is meat. And so now we are pretty healthy, but all we eat is meat. So, and drink water and have salt. And that's our whole diet, which is radical and nothing that we thought we would ever have to do or even thought of doing. But turns out that people can only live with meat. You know, the Inuit can live with blubber and meat, and the Maasai in Africa, they eat blood and milk. So there are societies that only eat protein. They don't eat anything else, and they survive just fine. So turned out we could survive just fine, and now I've been eating that way for 5 years, and I'm probably healthier than I've ever been. So
Incredible.
so you know, you bump up against things. You never know what's going to be helpful, but everything you do is helpful. That's what I've found. Everything you do, right? All my art, I ended up renovating my house a number of times and making it better, making it livable. The first time we bought it, it didn't even have a usable bathroom. You know, it was an old house. We had to take down everything but the bricks, and I put on a worker's hat and a checkered shirt and put the cell phone in my hand and slept with it on my pillow. And renovated the house.
Yeah.
And so you never know what you're going to do. When I was a massage therapist, when my daughter was ill, I put my massage table at the end of her bed.
Yeah.
And every night when she was in severe pain, I could massage her and put her to bed and she could sleep at night. So you don't know what you do is going to be useful in your life. You know, when my dad had surgery, he had a knee replacement at about 80. I went and took my laser there and lasered his knee every day, 5 days after he came out of the hospital. I lasered his knee every day for 2 weeks. And at the end of that 2 weeks, we went to the hospital to speak to the surgeon about how he was doing. And an intern came into the room and said, Dad said, I hear that going swimming is helpful for knee rehabilitation. And he said, yes, it is. You can go swimming. Because his knee looked the same as the other knee. There was no swelling. The incision was white after 2 weeks. And the surgeon came around the corner. He said, what do you mean you can't go swimming? It's only been 2 weeks since you had surgery. But the laser had healed it so quickly. It was really a miracle to see. So I didn't know that's what was going to happen when I had the laser too. So, you know, you just don't know. You have to follow your interest. Follow your interest. Find and not worry about the outcomes, because the outcomes are not for us to know.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And you mentioned following your interests. And for some people at this younger age, they kind of find it difficult to find what they want to do in their passion. So for
Mhm.
you, how did you find out what you wanted to do?
Well, part of it was reading that book, What Color's My Parachute?
Right.
The other thing that I did was my husband wrote a program called Future Authoring. You
Right.
can find it selfauthoring.com.
Mhm.
And I did that program when it was still pencil and paper.
Yeah.
So I wrote my answers, and it was a very interesting program because, well, for me, because I was a creative person, the first
Yeah.
part of the program, you're supposed to dream about who you might be in 3 to 5 years. If you were someone who was doing the best for you.
Yeah.
So if you were somebody who was doing that, what kind of life would you have? And so it was really just a function of daydreaming and writing it down, writing down a daydream. And I dreamt that I would have a spa, that I would have a juice bar, a massage room, a place to do a place to exercise
Yeah.
and to do yoga. And it's funny because years later, in my basement, I had an infrared sauna,
Right.
a massage table, and a place to do yoga. And I thought, I got my spa eventually.
Right.
So, you just don't know what it's going to be. So it's all you have to do is not be afraid to take a step forward, because the worst thing you can do is not take a step forward,
Right.
Yeah.
right? It doesn't matter what step you're taking, as long as you're taking a step in some direction, it will get you to the next place.
Right.
Yeah. So if you get an acceptance to a university, say you get an acceptance to 3 different universities, how are you going to decide what to do?
Right.
Well, you can write a list of your minimum interests. So you could write, I want to be, I don't know, I want to be where my best friend is, maybe would be one, or I want to be within 400 miles of home might be another one, or I want to be on the art side of things, or I want to be on the science side of things. I want to live how you want to live. I want to live in residence. I want to live with roommates in an apartment. You could write a list of your minimum requirements for
Right.
being satisfied at university, and then look at all the universities and see what they have to choose, and see if any of those fill those requirements. There's different ways to choose what you want to do, but it really, in a way, doesn't matter what you do, as long as you are pursuing something that seems meaningful at the time. You're good to go.
Right.
Yeah.
So for my third question is, who has inspired you throughout your life to become like who you are right now?
Well, I would say my grandmother was, I had a grandmother who was an artist. So I was taught a little bit when I was very young how to paint from her. And she was a philosopher. So even when she was 98 years old and her husbands were both gone and her siblings were all dead and her children were all dead, she would wake up and say, you know, it's time to go, but isn't it a beautiful day? So she had a very good outlook on life. She knew that to be grateful for the day, even if you felt like you were done, to be grateful for the day. And I think that that has been very helpful because I've learned to live in the present
Right.
and not worry about the future, to do what I can, but only the next right thing, and know that that is guiding me to the right place. And so that was my grandmother. Let's see who else was inspiring. Well, you know, my older sisters,
Mhm.
they were 5 and 7 years older than me. So by the time I went to university, they were out of university and married.
Right.
And my brother, he was 8 years older than me. He had children when I was in high school. So they were very helpful to me because I was very fortunate to have them come first so I could take guidance from what had worked for them and what hadn't worked for them.
Right.
And one thing that I thought with my sisters, both of them ended up divorced. They were in competition with their husbands. You know, they went out to get a career, which I think is great, and their husbands went out to get a career, but they weren't really. She wasn't really in support of her husband, so
Mhm.
there was some um, unresolved issues that weren't negotiated out. And so negotiation is super important. And things that people don't often do is to, if you come up against in your relationships, if you come up against a problem that won't go away on its own, then you're going to have to sit down and negotiate. And you have to negotiate till both people agree
Right.
that what the negotiation is something they can accept. So you don't want someone just saying yes, they'll accept it, but they're not putting a truthful effort into it. You know, you have to be, if you aren't going to tell the truth to yourself, there's no way you can tell the truth to other people. So and that's very tricky. You know, the sins, the seven deadly sins, pride and envy are the psychological sins. They're very tricky to understand because they're psychological. You know, they're not physical sins. It's not like gluttony. That one's pretty easy to identify. Other people can identify it for you. But pride and envy, those are inside of us and they are tricky. And that's why they're the most subtle and the most severe of the sins that there are. And I think pride and envy are two of the sins that our society is really suffering from these days.
Yeah.
You know, the idea that, so Jordan and I go on tour and we take questions from the audience. And one of the questions that comes up quite often is, how can I find the perfect partner for myself? And fair enough, that there's a question, but we didn't answer that question. And then the second night we had it and we didn't answer it either. And then the third night we got the question again, and it was like, what is this question? And then we realized, you know what? That's not the right question. The question is, who can I become? Who can I become so that a partner wants to be with me?
Right.
And so our society hasn't taught us that. It teaches us what can we get? What can we, but it's not about that. It's about what can we give? What can we give? And not to other people necessarily. What can we give ourselves is right, because who we're going to be tomorrow is different than who we are today. So that isn't giving to ourselves in the immediate gratification, just today's, but this is something that you can give yourself when 10 years down the road. Who am I going to be 10 years down the road? And what can I do for myself to help that person? Because that's going to be myself. Now I'm 18, I'm going to be 28. Who is that? Or 40 years down the road when I'm going to be 50 or 60. What can I do today so that that person is going to be helped? And if you do one thing a day for yourself, and then you can recognize one thing you can do for someone else. How do you recognize what you can do for someone else? You have to listen and you have to watch, because you don't want to impose what you think is good for someone else. You want to notice what they need and
Yeah.
then offer.
Right.
And man, you have no idea where you'll go when you do those kind of things, because the outcome is you don't know what's going to be. So it's an adventure.
Right.
Yeah.
And you mentioned in the future, like 10 years, who are you going to be and how are you going to change? And one thing that you also talk about a lot is being in the presence and being in the moment.
Yes.
And a lot of people really kind of zone out from that motive and something like that. So I want to ask you, how could one learn to be in the moment?
Okay. Well, I think well, meditation helps with that.
Hmm.
So I pray. So prayer and meditation helps with that. When you're meditating, really, you're asking for guidance.
Hmm.
When you're praying, often, when I pray for, the sick and the dying, and I pray for uh, the people in war uh, to be guided into a better place, and so that's prayer. Meditation, that's listening,
Hmm.
right? That's listening. So you're listening, and you're pausing. So
Hmm.
say something happens and it makes you uncomfortable.
Right.
So it gives you feel uneasy about that. And lots of people do not like to feel uneasy. So they'll do something, right? They'll go for a walk, which is a pretty good thing to do. Or maybe they'll eat some sweets to make themselves feel better in the moment, so they can just kind of avoid what it is that they're thinking about. But if you can notice that you're feeling uncomfortable, and you can stop
Hmm.
and maybe take yourself from that situation and go to a place that's quiet, then you can ask. You can ask, what is it that I don't understand about this situation that's making me uncomfortable?
Right.
And then not act until you find an answer. So I'll give you an example.
Hmm.
So I was on tour with my husband. He wasn't feeling very well. And we were getting to the point where we thought we were going to have to stop touring, because he was able to still give his lectures, but it was very difficult for him, and it was hard to watch because he was struggling so much. And I went home. I flew home, and I decided I couldn't go on tour anymore. But I decided that I would ask. So I asked, I said, okay, God, what do I have to do to go back on tour?
Yeah.
And God said, you have to get your own hotel room. And I thought, my own hotel room? Really? That would probably make my husband angry. Maybe I shouldn't get my own hotel room. So I phoned a friend and I asked her, I said, what do you think about what I just heard, that I should get my own hotel room? And she said, yeah, I think you should do that, because you need your own space. You're on the road all the time. Uh, I said, oh, okay. So I booked my own hotel room and went back on tour. So it allowed me to go back on tour. And it gave me time. And I had no idea what I had been doing. So my husband would come home at midnight. I would already be asleep. I
Hmm.
would get up at 7 in the morning. He would still be sleeping. So I'd fumble around in the dark and grab my clothes and my, whatever I needed, and go out in the hallway and pray and do everything else that I was needing to do. Once I had my own room, I could open the blinds.
Yeah.
I could do my prayer myself. I could interview people on my podcast, which I wasn't doing because we were sharing a room. We didn't have enough room for both of us to be doing our work. And it turned out that when we wanted to spend time together, we could spend time together. When we didn't want to spend time together, we had our own space.
Right.
But I wouldn't have known that if I hadn't sat down by myself, taken the time I needed away from everything, and asked a truthful question, something that I needed. And when I first started doing that, sometimes it would take me 2 weeks to get an answer,
Mm.
because I hadn't been practicing this. But now I practice it, and I can get answers as I ask them sometimes. So it's a practice. And that's why they say practice prayer. That's why they say practice meditation, because it's a practice. That's why you don't think of that. When they say giving birth, when a woman gives birth, it's because it's a service. And I never thought of that before. I just thought of that like yesterday, the day before. I thought, that's a form of service. When you think of service, you think, what's a form of service? Making dinner for someone, that's a form of service. Doing someone's laundry, stopping by the side of the road and helping someone if they need, that's service, right? But giving birth, that's also service. And so when a woman decides to have a baby, she's doing an act of service. And if you want to be in the right place, you want to be serving.
Yeah.
And so that's how you can tell that you're in the right place, as if you're serving.
In the last question, you did mention your podcast. And one thing I really wanted to ask is on one of your episodes on October 28th this year, you and your guests talked about self-reflection. And I found that topic very interesting. And I was wondering, how do you self-reflect?
Okay, that's a good question too. Let's see. So I think self-reflection is one of the most important things that we do.
Mhm.
That's what I've found. And I'm 60. If you could learn this younger, that'd be really good. Right? And I would have liked to learn it younger, because I always wanted to be learning. I always wanted to be understanding
Yeah.
where my motivations were coming from, and why sometimes things didn't go right. Right? I always wanted to know that. And so those are cues. Those are cues to self-reflect. So if you're feeling uncomfortable, and you can go by yourself and realize what it is that's making you uncomfortable, then you're, on your way to understanding and to making a difference. Now, there's some things you can do. So one of the things that we really suffer from these days is resentment. There's a lot of resentment in our society, and I've suffered from resentment. I understand it. And so resentment, we'll talk about that. Let's see if I can think of a resentful thing that I've had. Well, when my husband was sick, my daughter took him to Russia. He had been very sick. He was on lots of psychiatric drugs, and in our society, they put people on lots of drugs. And the only place we could find where they would take him off the drugs was Russia. So she took him to Russia. And I had just got out of the hospital because I had been very sick. And so I was at home. And so over that year that he was away, and that was a difficult year because I was just getting well, and I was worried about him because he was so sick and I couldn't be with him because he was so far away. I was kind of resentful that my daughter took him away. And so I found myself feeling resentful about her, and I didn't want that. And so I would walk every day and ask for the resentment to be lifted from me. But over, I think it was a week, at least a week that I was walking, I did some other things. So one of the things I did was I looked at positive personality traits, and you can get lists of personality traits on Google. And I think I had, I don't know, maybe 30 traits. And I went through them and I listed all her positive personality traits.
Mhm.
And the thing about resentment is often it's about one thing.
Yeah.
But people just aren't that simple. We have a very broad array of associations that we have with each person that we know. And so by writing down all of her positive personality traits, I fleshed out who she was. And so then this one thing that I was concerned with lost its potency, because then she was just more developed character. And then I could see her in a more generous manner. So I was able to squash this one particular problem that I was concerned with. Now, the other thing that I could do was that I did in the beginning was wrote down, what's my problem? I'm feeling resentful. Who am I resentful at? I'm resentful at my daughter. What do I think that she's taken from me? Well, she's taken away my personal relationship with my husband.
Mhm.
She's impacted my money, because now I'm not with him, and so he's not working, and so we have less money, or I'm uncertain about what will happen, if he's going to live or not. So it's impacted my financial ideas of what could happen. So I have a couple of things that make me anxious about that, right? Because my personal relationship is interrupted, and maybe my finances, my security are interrupted because he's gone. And then the next thing is, what is it that I could do? What is it that I may have brought to this? So then I have to think about myself, and I have to think, okay, what did I do? Well, first of all, I didn't go. So I'm not in Russia. I could have gone, but I didn't go. Nobody really wanted me to go because I was not well enough, but whatever the reason, I'm not there. So if I was there, I could have been there. What else could I do? I could talk to my daughter more. And that would probably uncover some of the problems that we're having, because most of it is just miscommunication.
Yeah.
And so that's what I'm bringing to it. So there's miscommunication. And what else am I bringing to it? I'm angry. I'm feeling sorry for myself, self-pity, right? I have self-pity. So you have to think about, really kind of have to think about all the things that you don't want to think about, really, right? So self-pity. Oh yeah. I definitely suffer from that. Maybe I'm envious that she got to go and I didn't go. So maybe I'm suffering from envy. So, and usually there's quite a good long list of them, but that's a few. That's a few you can, and that kind of humbles you a little bit, right? Because then you realize that you're not right, first of all. And a lot of the trouble that people have is we end up thinking we're right. And if we're right, well, then how are we going to make up with this other person? Because if we're right, they're wrong. So if you can think about how you might have been wrong, even in one way, then you humble yourself a little bit. So then at the end, well, how could I have done that differently? Well, in terms of self-pity, well, I could do something for someone else that would take me out of self-pity. Envy, how could I stop myself from being envious? Well, do something for myself that I want, and I don't have to be envious of what other people have, right? So, and we have a hard time giving ourselves things often. And so we have to be careful that we haven't denied ourselves so much now that we're resentful of what other people have or envious of what they have. And so this is the thing, reflecting on yourself is it's a practice in humility, really, because you are uncovering those things about you where you're deficient, where you haven't truly supported yourself, and also uncovered any kind of an old habit, an old coping skill that is now you're older and you don't need it anymore. But you got to reflect and know that, because maybe you learned something then when you were 2, you learned a way to cope with something and you haven't updated that. You can update that now, because now you're 18 and you don't need that anymore. And you don't want it anymore because it was an outdated and immature attitude. And maybe it was selfish, right? Maybe it's a selfish attitude. 2-year-olds are pretty selfish, but they don't know how to share. They don't know how to share. They can only really play on their own. They're delightful little creatures, but they're not social. And so they might end up, say they don't get enough attention, then they might end up wanting more than they might have if they were given more, right? So if they, as 2-year-olds, but when you get older, you might still be wanting what you wanted it to. You want to look at that. You want to look at that and see if you are being selfish, if you have self-pity, if you're spending too much time thinking about yourself rather than thinking about what you could do for other people being yourself in the future, not just today. Because self-pity is really about me right now. Me right
Right,
now, I'm not happy. Right now, I don't have what I want. And that makes you, uh, that takes away the playfulness. See, that's something that you can look at. And that's a good reason for self reflection. If you're not feeling playful, if you're not feeling like you want to really play with someone and tease them and jump, go and do something that's full of joy, then you know that you're not in the right spot.
right,
That means that you're probably suffering from one of these. You're suffering from envy or pride or self-pity or selfishness or something like that, or you're blaming someone for something that you might be able to uh, deal with if you think about what you could do to make the situation better.
right,
And so, and after you think about that, you think, well, how could I do this better? And you think about those things you're suffering from, and think about what you could do instead. Could I be more generous? Could I be of service? Could I uh, do something for myself that I haven't been? And a lot of times, women suffer from that, and the reason for that is we have personalities that are made of 5 different attributes. Openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And so some of them are positive, like extroversion is a positive personality trait. Uh, uh, Neuroticism is a negative personality trait. So when someone is very calm, that would be the positive side, and neuroticism would be the negative side. So there's this personality traits that are positive and negative, and they flesh out who we're going to be. So, so I'm not a mathematician, right? That's not my personality. I'm an open person. I'm more open. I have a creative aspect to me where I want to be engaged with uh, um, things that have an open-ended uh, resolution to. I'm curious about problems. I like to be involved in something that feels like there isn't an answer to, I guess.
right,
That makes me a creative person, possibly. And so then I end up being a person who's engaged in my life will be uh, my life will be filled with those situations that complement my
right,
personality,
yeah,
and that would be, unless I'm feeling selfish and
right,
self-pity and all these things, then that'll hide me from who I am, and it'll take away the joy in my life.
yeah,
So if someone is working at a job and they're angry
yeah,
and they're not having fun, then they have to realize that they're not where they should be, and that someone else should be in that position and not them. So,
right,
a lot of these people who are trying to solve the world problems, how angry they are, they're angry and they feeling like, and they're worried and angry, and they think that the world's falling apart. So they're worried and angry, and they want to solve the world's problems. But if you're worried and angry and trying to solve the world's problems, then you're not the right person for the job,
right,
Yeah.
because it's too tricky for you. You bit off more than you could chew. You need a
right,
smaller problem,
yeah,
something that you can handle and feel some positive emotion because you've been challenged and you've been able to do something good.
right,
Then you're in the right spot.
right,
Yeah.
So
Uh,
all of that is self-reflection.
so we just want to say thank you so much for spending the time answering a couple of our questions. We're going to move on to our final question. And on the podcast, it's usually known as the big question. Are you ready?
Ready.
So, our big question to you is, what advice would you give to the younger generations?
I think what I would have liked to know when I was young, and it's different now. You guys we had kind of global problems because the Russians and the Americans were were in a war when I was young. So there was war when I was young, just
Mhm.
like there is now.
Right.
And so that's tricky. That's a tricky place to be. But I think what it would have been good for me is to know that my the most important place for me to be and the
Mm.
most important thing for me to do is going to come from where I am.
Right.
So to look around me where I am in my home and in my neighborhood,
Yeah.
because these are children that are not yet, they haven't left home yet, so they are still in their own community. What can I do? Where does their where what's interesting to what bothers me? What
Uh-huh.
bothers me about my family and
Uh-huh.
what bothers me about my town? And
Right.
realize that those are our problems, that's my problem to deal with. So that's my challenge, is
Right.
to
Yeah.
find out how to improve what bothers me about my relationships and what bothers me about my town.
Yeah.
That's a challenge and it's an opportunity. And doing that, practicing that will help you when you leave home to be uh, someone who can now take that more broadly.
Right.
If you learn to take care of yourself, your home, and your community when you're in high school, then when you get to university, you could start thinking about what you'll want to do in a in your society.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. Uh, we just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to meet with us. It was an absolute pleasure. And yeah, thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And I think what you guys are doing is great. I mean, it's amazing how much you can learn by having a conversation. And so I think that doing these things, this is very smart. So good for you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, that's all we have for you guys on the Three Peaks podcast. We see you guys on the trail next time.
Bye bye.